The Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z here, author of the Cannabis Business Book, and you're listening to the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, where I chat with and coach the highest performing entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. The Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z here, and on today's episode of the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, I'm joined by my dear friend, Kristin Jordan, who we go back for several years now in the New York scene. Kristin is an attorney by trade or background or whatever the right word is, but to say that you're just an attorney would be a massive understatement. You've done so much in the industry on the advocacy side, on the entrepreneurial side of things, and you've really spanned from the grassroots all the way to most recently to, what I'll call corporate cannabis with a large MSO being Acreage Holdings, where you're currently working. And so I'm excited to share the breadth of perspective and insight that you have, Kristin. And I'm just so delighted to see you and to catch up. So thank you for joining me. And if you wouldn't mind, can you please just do a little more of a professional intro, if you will?
Sure. Mike, thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be on with you. As you mentioned, we go back a long time. I think you're one of the first folks that I met in this industry, or the community at least. And, I think that we've always supported one another and had a close friendship. So I really appreciate what you're doing and appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. So in terms of my career and my professional interest in this space, traditionally I am a real estate attorney. I've been practicing, I think this is my 23rd year in practice, and always been in Manhattan, in New York City, and either working for law firms or managing real estate portfolios for retailers or large-scale corporate real estate departments in large companies. And gosh, I think my normal routine is to say 5 years ago, but I think it's like 6 or 7 years ago now, is when I made the commitment to come into the cannabis space. And at the time, we had just passed our medical, the Compassionate Care Act in New York. And so I think it must have been 2015, probably the summer, when I became aware of the medical program. And I believe I probably attended my first High NY event sometime around then, and realized that this opportunity was coming, and presented a nascent industry for which not only was I a quiet consumer, but also somebody who believed in using this industry as a way to provide generational wealth to communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. And so back then, gosh, I thought that I would be practicing, and I used to represent the hospitality industry, restaurants and bars, in obtaining liquor licenses. And in 2015, we had the benefit of seeing a couple of programs get established in the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, I'm thinking of Oregon, where the medical program rolled up into the liquor authority. So we had, thoughts that potentially could also look the same. And those applications looked very much like traditional liquor license applications. So because I had that expertise just on the traditional hospitality side, that's what I thought I would be doing. But fast forward several years later, and not doing that at all, because we don't have a license program. As you know, the first round of licenses went out. Applications were submitted, and we've never had another round of applications. So that really was not a viable opportunity for me. From that, I had the good fortune of meeting a number of different people in the New York City community, and just a wonderful mix of young and old, and professionals and consumers and patients, and all kinds of folks. And gosh, I think shortly after probably coming to a High NY event, we started hosting some events at my law firm And the goal for which was just to really, get folks excited about some of the different opportunities that we were seeing happening out west. And it's funny, I look back now at some of our speakers who are willing to travel on their own dime and come and speak to a small room of 50 people and eat some Jamaican jerk chicken with us, and discuss their business endeavors. And today, they're large scale companies. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of Bob Ashino and The Incredibles. Everybody knows The Incredibles, and back then, it was a tiny little upstart. So it's really incredible to see, how the industry's evolved, and how some small operators, specifically in Pacific Northwest and in Colorado, have expanded and grown their businesses. Then of course, I helped to found the Cannabis Cultural Association, a nonprofit organization that was intended to provide tools and resources to communities of color to allow them to participate in the legal market. It was always very important to me, and I know it's important to you, that folks who have been participating in the legacy market up until now, really have real opportunities to make a living and to transition into the regulated market. And we it's so important for New Yorkers to recognize that, for so long, these entrepreneurs have been working on the down low, providing us medicine and wellness, at their own personal cost. And it's time that we acknowledge that and transition those folks into a regulated market. Gosh, after CCA, I got involved in industrial hemp. Lost a couple of my bank accounts along the way because of the ridiculousness around banking, and worked at a couple law firms. And now I find myself here at Acreage, which is fascinating. It really is the first time that my traditional skill set of managing real estate portfolios matches up with where the industry's at in terms of hiring talent. I never thought that this was really going to be an opportunity for me. I had always thought that potentially I would, do something on the activist front, be it around diversity and inclusion or something along those lines. But it's really been very eye-opening to not only lend my skill set to the industry, but also to see, how the industry is starting to mature and to become, a much more sophisticated industry. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got to where I'm at today.
Amazing. And as I said, really a diverse background of experiences in cannabis, from getting into it without, having an idea of what you thought you were going to be working on, and then having that evolve, forming a nonprofit. Shout out to the CCA. Love the CCA, all the great work they do. And then working at cannabis law firms, and now ending up at Acreage Holdings, one of the big multi-state operators. You've really have run the gamut, and I'm curious to take a step back, like how or why did you decide to even get involved in cannabis in the first place?
Well, let's see. I guess that was in 2015, and I was reading about the medical cannabis program. And at the time, let's see, I think I had just turned 41, 42, something along those lines. And I was ready to start thinking about my own cannabis consumption, and to really examine what that looked like. And so for so long, I had thought that my consumption was problematic. As a woman and as somebody in New York, as an attorney, consumption hadn't been something that I had shared in many of my professional settings. And in my social circles, a lot of my friends were getting pregnant and having families. And I found that I was spending a lot of time socializing in garages with husbands. And I think with the knowledge of the medical program coming on board, and then seeing what was happening out west, I just felt like it would be an easy way for me to transition publicly about my own personal consumption. And quite honestly, I did a lot of, and I continue to do, I'm sure you're the same way. I do a lot of reading around cannabis. I mean, I can't tell you how many newsletters I subscribe to, and how many different articles I read every day, not only on the industry, but also on the medicine. One of the most influential books for me was the Cannabis Manifesto by Steve DeAngelo. I'm sure everybody has read that, and if they haven't, I highly recommend it. And for me, that was the first time that I really thought about my own cannabis consumption as wellness. I'd never really thought about that as a term. It was really clear to me that many folks receive medicinal benefits, but I really hadn't thought about my consumption as medicinal because I'm not epileptic. I didn't have any severe symptoms or conditions that I was treating myself with. And to consider myself medicinal, I wasn't convinced. I hadn't convinced myself. And this idea of wellness really resonated with me. And the way that Steve introduced it in his book just made a whole lot of sense to me. It's the same plant, and regardless of how you tax it or consume it, I truly believe that all consumption is some form of wellness for the consumer. So for me, it was the right time. Attitudes and people had changed, opinions had changed, and quite honestly, I was older now, and just more comfortable in my own skin and comfortable in just claiming who I am and owning that.
Awesome. So it sounds like a big part of it for you was really your personal connection to the plant.
Yes.
And the evolution of that, and just wanting to be involved in the industry. Awesome.
That's right.
And I will second that. Steve DeAngelo's book, The Cannabis Manifesto, is a must read if you want to be in the industry. And even if you don't, it's just a great source of cannabis education. And I will also recommend the Cannabis Business Book. If you want to be in the industry, I've done a lot of good work to get you advice from 50 industry insiders and my years of experience. So check both of those out on Amazon.com and add them to your cannabis library today. Kristin, I want to ask you, given that you've done so many great things in the cannabis space, and there's stuff that we kind of even skipped over, like your events newsletter and some of the events that you've produced here in New York. But I'm just curious, what about Kristin Jordan has allowed her to succeed and thrive in this industry, which is a tough industry? So I'm curious, what's your highest power?
Yeah. So when you sent me the questions, it's funny. The question is specifically, what's your superpower? And I always joke that my superpower is that you can tell me whatever time you need me to wake up, and I can set an internal alarm clock. So that's the answer to that question. I have a superpower in that I'm able to wake myself up at any given time. But in terms of the industry, I think the thing that sets me apart and that makes me a little bit unique is that I'm always somebody who is looking at what's missing. And for me, it's, what am I looking for? And then I pound my chest a little bit and complain that it's not here. And then I figure out, it's a new industry. If we want something to happen, we have to do it ourselves. So a couple of years ago, when I was trying to make a practice out of representing startup clients in the space, and was not successful because we don't have a program, I noticed that there were a number of events happening all over the place, conferences, speaking engagements, and back in 2015, 2016, for the most part, most of the speakers looked like you. And most of the speakers came from the West Coast. And I always felt, and still to this day, feel very strongly that the East Coast and New York and the tri-state area specifically, our cannabis program is going to look different. We live differently. Our composition is different. Our topography is different. Our geography is different. The way that we interact with the plant is different. The way that we have purchased on the legacy market is different from anywhere else. And, I think we can take best practices from other places in the country, and we have the benefit of seeing, successes and failures, but we are going to be unique. And so for me, it was really important to not only find the experts and the talent locally, and not only because we didn't have any money to bring folks here, but also because we just needed to hear more voices that were associated with our community, who understood, that there are a lot of folks who have to think about off-site consumption. We don't live like folks in Denver. We live on top of each other, and subsidized housing is everywhere. Like, I'm in the Upper West Side. I know you're in Brooklyn, and every place smells like weed, but police are only stationed in certain areas. And so those sorts of things are things that we as a cannabis community needed to address. So getting back to, what makes me unique, it's that, the Cannabis Cultural Association really came from this idea that there wasn't anything like this on the East Coast quite yet. We've got, some great examples of some folks that are doing some really great work in other places, specifically Nina Parks and Amber Center with Supernova Women, who, are looking to transition women who are in the legacy market, and they're doing some great things in Oakland. We can look at, other large-scale advocacy groups that are doing very specific policy. But there was no group in New York that was really looking to support in communities of that folks live in, right? Like, so a lot of our meetings happened in Manhattan because we had free office space, but it was also important to us to make sure that we did some events in Bed-Stuy. I think you came to our startup workshop there and supported that effort. And so it was always important for us to make sure that we were bringing these things back to the communities that could benefit from that. And also, frankly, finding those community members who are already doing this work. There was no reason for us to reinvent the wheel when there were already folks that, were doing this. We just wanted to bring other tools and resources, like the CPAs who understood, the 280E implications and some very intricate stuff around the cannabis industry specifically. And, we also wanted to make sure that folks understood, and this is always something that puzzles me as an attorney, is, when I was working in law firms, I would get calls all day, every day, asking, how do I grow it? How do I sell it? And my next question is always, are you a farmer? Are you a retailer? So what makes you think that you should be buying it or you should be growing it or selling it? I always encourage folks to think about what they are already doing and what resources they have around them. Because Mike, as we always talk about, for the gold rush, as an example, it was the guy selling the picks and the shovels who really made all the money, not the folks who were panning for gold. Same with alcohol prohibition. Joe Kennedy made a fortune on wine casks and liquor casks, not the actual liquor. And especially for communities of color, there's no reason to touch the plant if you don't have to. It puts you in harm's way. It puts you in the crosshairs of, frankly, a government that is still trying to figure out how to work with communities of color. So ancillary businesses and supporting businesses, service industries, I think are really where communities of color should really think about getting involved in. And those are things that can happen prior to legalization.
Yeah, absolutely. So the answer I heard there, which I love, and I want to highlight for a second, because so many people ask me, how do I get started? How do I get into the industry? How do I find a job? Where do I invest? Blah, blah, blah. And I always tell them exactly kind of what you just said, is take your existing skill set and figure out how to be of service or of value in cannabis. And the question that you ask, which I love, because to me, this is like the question to create innovation, is what's missing. You have to look around and see what isn't happening or what's
Right.
not going on, what's missing, and that you actually want and that other people actually want. And that's going to be the place where innovation actually happens, as opposed to, like all these other folks. How do I start growing? How do I start retailing? There's plenty of growers. There's plenty of retailers. And unless you really know what you're doing there, it's not a great place to go and try and compete and run a
Right.
cannabis business. So I completely agree with you that ancillary, and I've said this for years as well, is, that's a much more digestible entry point, especially if you don't have like really deep pockets or a great background in entrepreneurship. Why don't you start a little smaller, slower on the ancillary side, and where, quite frankly, you're not as limited by the state by state regulations, and you can actually scale a business, and there's a lot more upside potentially. So I
Yes.
completely agree with you on pretty much everything you said. so
That's why
so
we're friends, Mike.
exactly. High minds think alike. So Kristin, I want to ask you, what's it like being you these days, working for Acreage, and especially given the quarantine and pandemic and all that? I know prior to that you were on a plane like a couple of times a week, going here, there, and everywhere. I imagine that's not the case anymore. And so I'm just curious, what's it like working at a big MSO, and especially in times of COVID?
Well, I think it's no secret that many MSOs, ours included, that are publicly traded, it is not a great time for us, even pre-COVID. Access to capital has essentially dried up under COVID, but we had, some supply chain issues and other things, because of 280E and prohibition that were standing in our way. And the requirement to be vertically integrated in many states is also a huge hurdle for MSOs to have to deal with. So to your question, what is my everyday? So I started with Acreage in November, and to your point, I was on a plane. I think, it seemed like every week. I have some beautiful away luggage that is sitting in a closet now. So I've mastered my travel game, but I miss it. I do miss the idea of, growing a business and looking at property and adding my talent and expertise there. We were chasing some licenses and actually, sorry, I have to hold on that announcement. I'm trying to figure out if I can share with you something, but tomorrow, unfortunately. So yeah, that was it was fascinating to see. There were a lot of states that were coming online fast and furious, and we were making assessments as to whether or not to make plays there. But then COVID hit and everything went sideways. And you and I are both here in New York City. I'm in the Upper West Side, and a lot of my colleagues, once we realized that we weren't going back to the office, left the city. And so I think I'm one of very few people who are actually still in the city. I'm cleaning out my office tomorrow, actually. And so it's been really interesting because we are pretty remote. And I think New York, I don't know about your experience, but it's been very unique to speak to folks about other experiences. I'll say this, in some parts of the country, it doesn't feel like there was much impact. But, I had sirens every day. We had friends who died, frankly, families who were affected multiple times, specifically in Queens, and specifically brown and Black folks. So it's been super challenging to not only be in the heart of COVID impact and trying to keep ourselves safe, and not knowing exactly what to do in terms of protecting ourselves and what's appropriate, and how to interact with the world, grocery shop, all that stuff. But then, of course, we dealt with the murder of George Floyd, and we talked about this real briefly before the call, that this is a really unique time for cannabis, and there's so much intersectionality around the industry and impacted people, that I think it's really challenging for the industry to figure out not only how to operate, but how to address a lot of these issues that are being thrown at the industry. And I don't have any magic to that, and certainly that's not my role and position, and I'm grateful for that, because it's been challenging for me personally, as somebody who is not Black, but is a person of color and an immigrant, to understand not only how to be an ally and to support, but also to help navigate this space with my colleagues and to be, what's the word? I read something recently about the idea of being an accomplice versus an ally. And I think that to me rings so true, is that, one thing is to be an ally and to support movements and to support causes, but to be an accomplice is something else entirely. And to me, that means, putting yourself on the line, sitting in discomfort, not always knowing how to navigate this space as a non-impacted person. But Mike, I am an adopted person. My siblings are all adopted people as well. I have a transgender nephew whose father is Puerto Rican and whose mother is half Black and half white, my sister. And, we're all trying to figure out how to support, folks who come into conflict on a regular basis and who face discrimination regularly. So it's been really interesting. And I think from almost a historical perspective, I went to University of Richmond in law school, and I think it's fascinating to see how they're addressing statues and the Confederate flag in those areas. I mean, I remember, I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and I remember going to Richmond for law school and, having a drink with some colleagues and realizing that they had completely different textbooks growing up about, the Civil War and the ramifications around it. And it just, it was really eye-opening to see how our education really was so dramatically different and influenced the way that we thought. And this was back in, the mid-90s when there wasn't as much race conflict that was, front and center in those sort of areas.
Two things that come to mind for me. One is, you mentioned the experience of being in New York and realizing that a lot of people have a very different experience. And I have, a moment that stands out to me is it must have been in April when things were pretty bad here in New York. And I was speaking to someone in Colorado, and they were like, "Do you actually know anyone who's even gotten COVID?" And I was like, everyone I know knows someone who's died from COVID. And but that, to me, it was shocking that there were folks out there who were having, his experience, because they're out in a less dense place where it hadn't really been a thing yet. And I was just like, wait, what? Are you for real? So I remember that quite well. And, I think it's really interesting. I think it's connected to all of the other stuff with the, the racial tensions and the injustice and everything, where, we're so isolated in some ways from other people's experiences, or people with different experiences, that it's, until you really are faced with it, it's hard to even know that that's real, right? And I think that's a lot of that is part of the misunderstanding and struggle that's going on in this country, where so many people, just don't understand that an experience other than their own is actually real, and that even exists. And one thing that I think is really unique and interesting about cannabis is, obviously, as you and I know, cannabis is an intersectional issue, and you can't separate cannabis prohibition from institutional racism. And, if you look at cannabis policy, one of the things that led me to be an activist in cannabis was when I learned the history and how cannabis was being used as an excuse to basically harm Black and brown people, and to incarcerate them, and to strip them of their civil liberties, and also their basic human rights and human freedom. And what I think is really unique about our industry and our community is that it's kind of this double-edged sword, where we're all aware of that stuff, or not all of us, but most people in this industry are aware and care. And even though we don't have the answers, right? I'm not going to pretend like I have the answers, certainly not. And I don't think anyone really does, but at least I would say we're disproportionately the people in this community and industry trying, and we're aware and we're out there doing the personal work we have to do and trying to do the community work of making things right and of trying to be an accomplice as opposed to just an ally. And on the flip side, I think because it's cannabis, and I think this is true for cannabis across the board, I think we're held to a higher degree of scrutiny than any other industry. Because I feel like if we were talking to, a group of finance professionals or even medical professionals or any other kind of mainstream industry, I wonder if this issue is as big of an issue or comes up as frequently as it does in cannabis. And if there's as much, I guess what I'll say, like maybe internal accountability, because I feel like in our industry, folks really try to make an effort to, call people out or in, or, just try to at least move things in the right direction. And I suspect that that's not the case in most other industries yet. So what occurs to me is that, again, this is my bias, that cannabis is at the forefront of innovation. And, even on non-business issues, I think this community gives me hope that other folks in other industries will eventually take up some of these issues in a more serious way. And at the same time, we chatted about this a little earlier, that there is always the fear of, optical allyship and people just kind of checking the box or taking one step and then saying, oh, okay, I did the work and it's done. When in reality, this is going to be a lifelong battle, and it's going to take a long time to really undo all the racism that's baked into America on the institutional foundational level. So I don't know.
Yeah. I worry though, Mike, sometimes that, I think for my sanity for the last couple of months, like I have defriended a number of folks on Facebook. I think my tolerance level for opposition is just not there anymore. I don't engage folks with different viewpoints anymore because it's folks are so polarized now. There's no amount of convincing that's going to happen on Facebook one way or the other, and all it does is just ruin your day. So I don't engage in that anymore, and I simply just defriend, and I think that that's becoming a thing. But I wonder if you and I are sort of in a little bit of an echo chamber, in that we're hearing what we want to hear, and we talk to people who we want to talk to. And I say that specifically because I'm thinking about, I was scrolling through Instagram the other day, and I saw a post about a mutual friend of ours who was highlighted for some inclusivity work that she's doing in one of the major publications. And I was appalled by the comments on there. And I was, no one who was familiar to me, but it was a gut punch to remind me that this is a huge industry. And, like many other vices or whatever you want to call, or medicines or wellness attributes, there is no discrimination in terms of who the consumer and the wellness users are. And, I was reminded that, Roger Stone spoke at an event a couple of years ago, for which I helped to boycott. And, those differing viewpoints are alive and well in our ecosystem, for good or for bad. I think they help to remind us that the fight's not over, and that we need to continue to be accomplices for the benefit of those other folks who are on the front lines and who are brown and black, who are now starting to get some attention, and it's incumbent on us to stand up and make sure that they are protected.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I know exactly what you're talking about, and it was really a tricky moment for me, because I was like laying on this couch right back here, just on Instagram randomly, and I saw this, and I went and I checked out the comments, and I was just, first of all, shocked, because it was clearly like so. I mean, to me, the only word that I can adequately use here is ignorant. it was clearly people who didn't really, it didn't seem like they actually read the article or
Yeah.
anything that had any relevant data. And instead they were just, the responses were just so angry and, just so critical of our friend who does great work, who's been a pioneer and a leader and, in my judgment is really courageous and innovative and consistent, which, it's not every day you get that combination of characteristics in anyone. And so what I was personally, I was like, well, what do I do here? And I commented, I was like, so kind of the word verklempt, I just didn't know what to do. Cause I said, okay, I can comment here and say, hey, you ignorant bullies, you don't know what you're talking about. This person is great and she does good work. And I did say something to that effect. And then I couldn't help but feel like, does that matter? Does my voice here actually matter? Am I going to make a difference? And, it kind of goes back to what you said about like, kind of unfriending these people where there's so many people that just don't even care about what the truth is. And they just want to be right. And they're not, they're not interested. That's why I like to say we live in the world of fake news because people don't even care what's true. They just want to feel like they're right and validated. And, it was a good reminder that there's still a ton of work to do. And even in cannabis, and, I think there's this myth, and I'll say I'm guilty of perpetuating this sometimes, that, cannabis community and cannabis culture is so, peaceful and idyllic and everyone is just, doing great things for humanity. And the reality is that, that's not true. And when I saw the response to this article and how many people were so bothered by the fact that a woman of color is fighting for more diversity and inclusivity in cannabis, which, we know the history, we've alluded to the history, and people were so taken aback by that and were so offended by that. It really made me go, huh, wow, like there's so much work to do here.
Yeah.
And it was a little scary, but also, I guess it's good to get that reality check every once in a while. And, I guess it left me wondering, what's my part? How do I help here? How can I, support this friend in her work and also just, help these folks that don't want to see reality get a little bit in touch with reality. So I don't know.
Right. I mean, Mike, I think it also, we talked earlier that I'm not a very good promoter of the things that I do. We haven't even talked about any of the events, and I actually am promoting and producing the Cannabis Media Summit for October of this year. This will be our third annual Cannabis Media Summit. And I think the other point that I want to make about that interaction and that Instagram post is that the media publication for which that posted this article and this interview, it's an old publication, and it carries with it an audience that looks more like you than it does me, and carries with it some old ways of thinking. And I think for me that makes me want to promote and source companies that care about these issues and have different audiences. There are more than one media companies in the game, and if that's a company that has a certain kind of audience that doesn't appeal to me, I want to make sure that I'm promoting and buttressing groups that are supporting the same ideals, and that's not hard. I mean, there are a lot of other groups doing some really great things. We don't have to go back to the well for which we're finding poison.
Love that. And I feel inclined and inspired to say her name. And I want to shout out Mary Pryor from Cannaclusive. And, she's been doing great work in this space for years and is as dedicated an activist for cannabis and justice reform as you can meet. I feel like all the recognition that she's received has been well earned and well deserved. And, and I think that's why, and I'll say their names too, High Times highlighted her because she does great work. And it's just so crazy to me that so many people took offense to that and probably didn't even read the article. And yeah, so shout out to Mary Pryor. Mary, you keep up the great work. Fuck the haters. The people who really know. And that's all that matters. And I'm sure Mary knows that. And
Absolutely.
I got to get her on the show. It's long overdue.
Yes.
But that's on me. So anyway, Kristin, I want to ask you, this is my favorite question. I don't ask everyone this question, but I was recently asked and it caught me so off guard. So I want to ask you more as a friend, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And I'll give you the option to skirt that question if you want, and ask you, where do you see the industry in 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, I'm excited for the next 10 years because I think that, I think that we will legalize in the next couple of years. Every year I say that, and every year I feel very convinced that we're very, very close to it. But this COVID world is changing everything. And so I do think that the tri-state area, we're hearing commitments from the governors in the tri-state area, and we will go as a region because of our interconnectedness and the way that we work among the three states, Connecticut and New Jersey, together with New York. And we see some efforts from the governors to try to, line up programs so that they can defeat any efforts to, traffic in goods and materials that shouldn't happen across state lines. So in the next couple of years, we're going to see these regulations probably very clunky and not advantageous to a lot of folks roll out. We're seeing Massachusetts, that has the first statewide social equity program roll out, and painfully, frankly, and it hasn't been easy. Illinois, very similarly, has made very great strides and is, very vocal about its intention to elevate and make sure that Black ownership is a part of their program. I think that the tri-state area has made those commitments, and quite frankly, I think we haven't legalized because we have very strong ally activists in this space who want to make sure that they'll do. So we want to make sure we do it right. And I think there's a lot of thinking around, the fact that we've lived under prohibition for this long. If we have to live it a little bit longer in order to get this right, I think we're willing to do that. Now I do caveat that with some hubris because, you and I are not folks that are impacted by the war on drugs on a regular basis. And, so for us to wait longer is not an impact to us. But, making sure that not only are criminalization efforts changed and those sorts of laws changed, but also pathways for entrepreneurship and business ownership are lined up also. Which brings me to, I'll try to be a little bit better of a promoter of the Cannabis Media Summit, which is happening on October 16th and 17th virtually. One of the things that we want to address, so we're the theme for this year is called Pot and Politics, is the idea and the troubling revelation that the DNC has rolled back its stance on legalization, and instead of promoting full legalization of cannabis, we're now looking at just decriminalization, which, Mike, it doesn't get us anywhere. That doesn't help patients, that doesn't help the industry, and that further feeds into a industry that will only be the big operators. So I think not only does the DNC need to be held accountable for that change in stance, but we need some answers. We need to understand, what the Democratic Party intends for legalization. And this just really feels like, and everything that I'm hearing from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is that, this is a real disappointment, and potentially, pushes us backwards rather than forwards. So I think that in the next few years, it's going to be incumbent on the states to really push that needle. And, not for nothing, New York is a state of 20 million people. And we are today the epicenter for finance, for, so much innovation, and business centric for the US that, if we can do this right, we could really be the gold standard, and we could really be the model for the rest of the state, or the rest of the country rather. And I think it's also going to be interesting for us because, thinking about us being a state full of 20 million people, right? We live in New York City, 8.5 million people in, a few miles of each other, but there are 12 million people who do not think the same way that we do, and who do not live and breathe and operate in the same way that we do. However, I am constantly reminded that socioeconomically, there are folks who fall into these demographics. And, I hail from Syracuse, New York, and in the Southern Tier and in places like that, white farmers, frankly, and low-income people have been providing medicine and wellness for generations in those areas. And they are not brown and black typically, but they also, are persecuted by police and dealing with stigma and all kinds of other issues. So I think there are things that we can all unite around. It's just finding those commonalities, but also acknowledging that as much as, we might find those similarities, that, bias and institutional racism are real and do exist, and are things that we need to address. And as uncomfortable as they are, as hard as those conversations are, I think that job is up for people like you and me to have, so that people like Mary don't have to be on the front lines of every single discussion. They don't have to have their bodies, and literally their bodies, on the front line of everything. It's incumbent on us to lead those discussions, especially since a lot of the folks that we're talking to look more like us.
I think you're 100% spot on. And personally, I'm very pessimistic about New York's ability to get things right, especially when I learned this week what's happening with the hemp program. And I just, I've always been a big critic of our medical program. And now when I see what's happening with the hemp program, I am even more pessimistic about adult use, but who knows, maybe they'll surprise me. Kristin, I want to shift gears into the coaching portion. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask you, what is your biggest business challenge or roadblock right now?
Yeah, Mike, so I am not a good promoter of myself. I would much rather talk about the work that you're doing or the work that Mary's doing. And so oftentimes I just forget to mention the big projects I'm working on. You alluded to the Maze calendar. I publish a newsletter in 10 different cities for all of the in-person and now online events that are happening in the cannabis space. We promote events that are specifically intended for professionals to understand how to transition your profession into the cannabis space. And, I am just not a very good promoter. Those were always side hustles and ways for me to stay engaged, and also to provide a stage for my friends and colleagues who I think are much more talented than I. So I could use help with figuring out how to be a better promoter of myself and feeling more comfortable in that area. So
what about that makes you feel uncomfortable?
Oh, I'm just a little nobody just trying to put things together. I just, I look at the giants around me and the folks that have led the way. And I am so privileged and honored to have so many of those folks like Wanda James and Ophelia Chong and Leah Heiss and Gia Marone and Shonda Macias, and I count them all friends, but certainly they're in a league of their own, and so it's challenging for me to sort of promote my side businesses.
So This is fun. I'm glad you brought this to me. I'm going to ask you to pretend for a moment that you are one of those ladies that you just mentioned. And I'm curious if, someone asked one of those women about Kristin Jordan, you know, I highly, highly disagree that they would say that she's a little nobody. I just can't imagine that would be.
Well, they're generous people.
Well, so put yourself in their shoes for a second and imagine what a Gia Marone or an Ophelia Chung might say about Kristin Jordan.
Gosh. I think that they would say that that one of my strengths is that I am very community minded, and maybe what I see as a failing could actually be turned around into a positive, in that I never am trying to create a stage for myself. It's always for for me to buttress other folks and to provide that platform. I'm really good at putting things together. I'm really good at production, and asking people to volunteer their time and efforts. And for some reason, people are generous with me. That's, I think, my superpower is getting folks to jump on a call or participate in an event or sponsor. But yeah, I think that's what they would say, is that I am a pretty good networker, and I've developed some good relationships that I call upon on a regular basis.
I don't disagree with you, but I'm going to challenge you because I think you gave me a very business-oriented answer. Put yourself in the shoes of one of these great ladies who you named, and imagine that they were being asked to promote you, and not just Kristin Jordan, the cannabis business lady, but Kristin Jordan, the human being. I'm curious what they would say about you and your character.
I think that they would say that I produce. If I commit to something, then I'm going to see it all the way through. And I think that that's something that is challenging in the cannabis space. There's a lot of starts and stops, and not all of those are for any bad reason. A lot of reasons things start and stop. But I think for me, if I really commit to something, I will see it through, even if it's painful.
Because what's true about you?
I think I'm a very loyal person. I think I'm a person of my word. Yeah, if I make a commitment to somebody or to something, it's very important for me to see that through to the end. And I think that's probably why people are generous with me, because whenever, like, I keep a laundry list. I have a list on my phone of it's just called follow-ups, and it's a rotation, and you're on that list of people that I just need to touch base with. And I look at that list periodically when I have calls with other random people, and if there's connections that I can make, or help that I can offer, and for me, that's because other people did it for me. And cannabis is a funny place. There's a lot of folks with their hands out looking for a referral fee, and for me, that just wasn't how I was brought into this space. It was always very generous people who were willing to give it their time and their effort. And it's not made me any money, and it's probably not a great business plan, but I'm in a position where I can do that, and to help to forge those relationships. And I think because of that loyalty and those ongoing cultivation of relationships, I've built up some trust, and folks do respond to that. So yes, I think that they would say that I am a loyal person. I'm a faithful person. I try to stand by all of my commitments, and I try to make sure that we're thinking about things holistically. Like, so for our events, something that my business partner, Annie, and I think about all the time is, I'm an introvert. I don't know if you realize that, but what I realize is that an introvert is somebody who recharges alone. And so people drain me. So this is draining to me. I will have to go medicate and not talk to anybody and play my Nintendo Switch and pick up shells on Animal Crossing for probably 2 hours. But I know myself now, and being a 40-year-old woman or 47-year-old woman, I know what it takes to get to where I'm at. And so when I think about attending conferences, and you've been to them, and the Javits Center and large scale things, and I feel like I'm a little bit lost. I'm not that important. It doesn't feel like a great space for me. So we always try to make sure that we're thinking about that person. So for instance, we keep our conferences very small. I want to be able for our guests to rub shoulders with speakers. We want our speakers to feel engaged. We want them to stay all day and to attend the other seminars. I also think about the content. When I go to some of these cannabis events, it's really basic level education. And so I find that I'm just socializing with colleagues, and it's really not worth the cost of the ticket because the education is just not there. And so we try to make sure, and we work with, I think this is another thing that's unique, is we work with our educators to really develop a syllabus. It's super time consuming and it's challenging. And I think that sprang from the first event that we did was the Cannabis Law Summit, which required accreditation. And so we already knew going in that, we had to put together a syllabus. And, when you're asking somebody to volunteer their time, they're not as willing to put that effort in. So we needed to work with all of our speakers to develop the materials. And we wanted it to be, really impactful. And I think one of the greatest compliments that we got at the Law Summit, or the Media Summit last year, was that we overheard a conversation where somebody said, I tell you, most of these things are Cannabis 101. This is graduate school level. And that felt so wonderful because, we give out notebooks. I think we gave you one of our Cannabis Media Summit notebooks. And it's always important to us to see people taking notes, to see that they're really getting something out of it. I mean, we have regulators, Commissioner Title from Massachusetts spoke for an hour, but she stayed the 2 full days and asked questions and was completely engaged. I believe actually one of her interns she met going to the bathroom, just being in the restroom at the same time. And so things like that, those sorts of unique experiences, they only happen in a small conference, in a small interaction, and in a small space, frankly. I mean, we think about everything. We think about the size of the space. We think about the types of meal that we're serving. It's important to us to not put turkey on a roll. We want to make sure that we are, supporting a local mom and pop ethnic food. So last year at the summit, we had Vanessa's Dumplings, a Chinese dumpling house here in New York. And there was a little bit of pushback. Not everybody's going to like it. And, everybody has different tastes. And certainly we accommodated. We had gluten-free. We had a vegan food. But it was important for us to, showcase ethnic food, as it's always been for me, and to make sure that we're supporting small businesses and restaurants, with the small budget that we do have. And so those interactions, those sorts of quality, networking spaces, it's a different thing to tell your guests to go out and get a sandwich and meet back in an hour, as opposed to having everybody sit around and eat family style. Those go a long way, and we hear some really great feedback. And not to knock some of the big conferences, I mean, those are important and they make a whole lot of sense. But for what we're trying to do, it's just a little bit more of a personal experience. And on the speaker front as well, I had the privilege of being asked to speak at a number of different events over the last few years, and I take away some of those experiences, and we try to incorporate, a meaningful experience. I mean, asking somebody to come on their own dime, give up their own time to really prepare in the way that we're asking them to prepare, it's a lot of time and effort. And while appreciate that they're getting a stage, and they're I think cannabis is still in its infancy, and that speakers don't really get paid. And that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people who are expecting to get paid, but we're a startup and this is my side hustle, and I'm not a good business person when it comes to it, to running that sort of thing for profit. There are much better business folks doing that for profit, but for us, it's just really about getting talent and expertise that doesn't get a stage normally. So those commitments, I think, hinder us in that it doesn't allow for us to think about ticket sales and really building a business. But I think that was never our goal in the first place. So yeah.
So if I were asked to promote Kristin Jordan, I would say,
what would you say?
She's creative, committed, community oriented, and she gets shit done. And above everything else, she does it for the right reasons. And so that's what I would offer. And I want to thank you so much, Kristin, for taking the time to chat with me today. I'm curious. I want to ask you, what was your highlight from our conversation, or maybe the best insight or moment from our chat today? And then I will let you go on your merry way to Nintendo Switch and whatever else you need to recharge from little old me.
Mike, my favorite thing about today was just catching up with you. I mean, under COVID, we just don't get those opportunities to see each other anymore. And, for 6 years, I mean, gosh, if I went more than a week without seeing you, that would be unusual. And so I miss my community. I miss passing a joint with you. I miss sitting and catching up and hearing stories about our friends and colleagues in the space. I miss all of that. I miss hugging you. I miss physical interaction with all of those people. I mean, those are, for 6 years, unlike any other industry, real estate or law or anything else I've ever done. I mean, you're my family now. This is chosen family. This is not just community. This is more than that, because we've struggled together and we've seen each other struggle and we've seen each other's successes and we've seen, interactions and all of this. At the end of the day, all of this is hard. I mean, this is something that I talk to, a lot with a lot of consultants, and, there's a lot of excitement around the space. There's a lot of flashy things that, attract people here, but none of this shit is easy. I mean, it's just every bit of this is hard, draining, exhausting, but it's also the most fulfilling thing that I've ever done in my life.
Amazing. Well, I love that answer, and warms my heart. And I want to say, just as a final parting words, a little bit of a joke for the folks watching at home. Even though we might make it look easy sometimes, Kristin's right. It's not easy. Kristin, this was so much fun. It's a blast as always to catch up, and I'm glad that everything is going well and that you're healthy and safe. And I look forward to the day that we can catch up properly in person and pass a joint. And until then, keep rocking and doing great work for the community. Thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you, Mike. Have a good day. Take care.
Kristin. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is the Cannabis Business Coach. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is
the Cannabis Business Coach.